All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this panel on how public input informs regulation. And we're specifically focusing on the future of CO2 pipeline safety. We've talked a lot about CO2 pipelines, we've talked about CO2 pipeline safety, and now we're going to really dive into the regulation aspect of it. So. My name is Amanda McKay. I am the policy manager for the Pipeline Safety Trust, and I've had the pleasure of working on CO2 pipeline issues since I started with the trust in April of 2022. A fun fact that you might not know about me is that I actually wasn't sure if I wanted this job after the first round of interviews. However, during the second round, we had an in-depth conversation about carbon dioxide pipelines. I had never heard of them before, and we talked about the Satartia incident. We went over some of the regulatory gaps and the policy issues, and after that interview, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And now that I'm in this position, working on a whole range of issues, I'm so happy that I took this job and get to stand up here with all of these experts to dive into these important questions around the future of CO2 pipelines. My hope for this panel is to take a small step back from some of the super technical aspects of carbon dioxide transport through pipelines and talk more about all of the work that has been done over the last year and beyond to strengthen public input on the regulation side of CO2 pipeline safety. From the time the pipeline ruptured in Satartia, Mississippi, to Dan Ziegert's article in the Huffington Post, to increased funding for CCS in the Infrastructure Act and the IRA, to PST's white paper on CO2 pipeline safety, and so much critical community education and action along the way. There have been a lot of developments over the last couple of years. And none of these developments would have been possible without many of the communities represented here today. As many of you are aware, there's been a lot of confusion and uncertainty around the regulations specific to CO2 pipelines. Concerns about temperature and pressure, crack arresters to prevent fracture propagation, emergency response measures, and more. Today, we are going to dive into some of those questions and concerns. I'm so fortunate to be standing up here with community representatives, regulators, and members of the industry so we can have these important discussions. So let's just jump straight in. I cannot do justice of introducing all of the lovely people up here today, so I will offer each panelist an opportunity to introduce yourself, how you have been involved in CO2 pipeline issues, and who you're representing today. Carolyn, would you like to go first?
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Raffensperger, and I work for the Science and Environmental Health Network, an organization that was put together, 30 years ago, because the environmental community was grappling with how science was both misused and used in environmental and public health policy. And the organization was created as a network of many of the national groups and smaller groups to really think through how science should inform public policy. And so I work with a crew of people, a doctor with public health expertise. I work with Sandra Steingraber, some of you may know her, a biologist, and work with a number of people like that. One of the things that we do is help translate science for community groups that are trying to defend their homes, their communities, their neighborhoods, future generations, from the kinds of toxics and hazardous materials that blanket especially this state, but many others. And so paradoxically, or parenthetically, I happen to live in a county where Dakota Access goes through, a rather notorious pipeline, and now home to a proposed CO2 pipeline, all in my county in Iowa. Turns out that we got a lot of expertise from the work we did with Dakota Access, I happen to have been a lawyer at Standing Rock, working to explain what the law was around the Army Corps of Engineers and other things with the tribes and with the people who were protecting the water there. Fast track to an announcement about CO2 pipelines about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. And I was really curious about this because I'm an environmentalist, and it said climate and CO2. And the more we figured out what was going on, the more we realized that this was not a climate solution, that it was unbelievably risky, that it was underregulated, and we needed to step in and find out what was going on, who had some sort of jurisdiction over this. And we put together a coalition, both in the state of Iowa and then regionally, to address the great shortfalls in regulations that we saw around CO2 pipelines. Put together remarkable coalitions, unexpected groups. I see landowners, the environmental community, and really put together something unique. And I'm part of a national coalition, 2 coalitions, that's working on carbon capture and storage. And I see Victoria sitting there, incredible leader and thought leader in this field, and have had the privilege of working with new groups and extraordinary minds in this work. So I'll pass it on.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. And good morning, everyone. My name is Jade Woods. I am a campaigner with the Center for International Environmental Law. I am a lifelong resident of Louisiana, and I was born and raised here. My family's been here for 6 generations, and so welcome to my home. I live just up the river in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, actually just outside of Baton Rouge in a small town called Port Allen. Not too far from several refineries and petrochemical facilities. So I have a close proximity to the issues that we're talking about personally, and my family has for decades. But also, I'm very delighted to be able to work on these issues in my home. And work full-time with incredible people and partners in this space. So earlier today, this morning, you heard from my colleague Eloise at Louisiana Against False Solutions. The Center for International Environmental Law, you might hear me abbreviate that as CIEL. CIEL is a member of that coalition in which we do work to connect resources and public education materials to the front line. And so something that I do as a campaigner quite frequently is hold community education meetings. We've held them in many, many parishes since I came on board about a year ago. And what we do is teach people either who live near the site of a proposed carbon injection well or a proposed CO2 pipeline, what is carbon capture? Do you know what this is and how it's coming to your community? And we really open up a dialogue with experts to allow community members to ask questions and educate themselves about this infrastructure. So I'm very happy to be here today and to speak with the folks on this panel, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of y'all's questions.
Thanks, Jade. Max, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Everyone here okay? Okay. Max Kieba, Director of Program Development. And yeah, in the opening session, there might be some first-timers here. So if you don't know, we're one of the smaller agencies in government with probably the biggest name and the most complicated acronym to say. But it's the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA. Sometimes we call ourselves OPS, the Federal Office of Pipeline Safety. But generally, we have a regulatory and safety authority for CO2 onshore and offshore pipeline transportation. There are also some authorities we would have for intermittent storage. Most of the talks you've probably heard is talking about permanent sequestration, so we don't have permanent sequestration. Another distinction, we don't have siting authority. Sometimes in these meetings our name comes up, and I know there's a session I believe tomorrow on siting versus safety, so hopefully some of that will be clarified. So we generally don't do production at a high level if it's in transportation, and generally if it's hitting a public right-of-way of some kind, it's going to fall under our minimum safety regulations. There are other pipelines that might go through federal lands. Typically that might be Bureau of Land Management, BLM. We also won't oversee any kind of pipelines on tribal lands. They're a sovereign nation, essentially their own government. So, but we will assist them if they ask for our assistance. How I got involved in CO2 pipelines, interesting. I might have to blame Bill Karam a little bit and Alan Mayberry. It was the middle of the pandemic, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, and I just happened to be in the office that day. People weren't showing up, and Bill happened to visit Alan, and questions came up on CO2 definitions, and when things change with phases and something like that. So I happened to be in the office. Alan pulled me over with Bill, and we started looking at regulations, and we said, yeah, there are some interesting questions here and on some of the dynamics. So that's how I got started. That's why I was in the engineering research group at the time. Since then, I've shifted over to a new role in program development. My group kind of has a blend of technical, data analysis, and policy, so we lean a little bit more into the policy side of things. We do touch on public engagement a little bit. It was mentioned, we had a public meeting earlier this year in May. I got worked over for a good couple of days, but it was good. I'm a supporter of leadership tendencies. Of conflict can be good if it's constructive, and we had a lot of good input from the public. Cindy Hansen is here. I had her get on the panel, and there was even some landowners we tried to get there directly, and they were like, why is someone from DC calling me? And first we had to convince them it wasn't some telemarketer or someone from some campaign. We said, no, we're going to come to Iowa, and we want to have you be on our panel. So it's really good to hear from some of the landowners directly. And then yes, all these dynamics of technical issues with the policy issues and things like that. So hopefully I'll help as much as I can clarify what we can.
Thanks, Max.
Hey, good morning. My name is Nicolas Medina. I'm the public and stakeholder engagement for the ExxonMobil Pipeline Company. Thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. I've been coming to the annual Trust Conference for about 10 years. Its core mission, diverse perspectives, and commitment to public input on pipeline safety is what makes it one of the most interesting ones for me to participate each year. This is the first time that I'm actually invited to be in a panel. And I think we welcome the opportunity to have a dialogue of how the public provides input into regulation and the impact of CO2 pipeline safety. Louisiana is dear to my heart. My wife was born here. I got 4 kids, and my oldest is a graduate of LSU. I consider Louisiana, like Texas, where I live, to be the base of my family. So for us in the industry at ExxonMobil, I've been 33 years working for this company in the industry. I've been in upstream, I've been in downstream. For the last 12 years, I've been midstream. What got me to the pipeline side and what got me to my first PST conference 10 years ago is I was the PIO, the Public Information Officer, at a significant incident that the company had in Arkansas 10 years ago. But I'm very proud of what we did then, because we lived up to our promise to make sure that, even when things go bad, that we will take care of those communities. Right? One of the things that I'm very proud, as an employee, as a member of the community, right, as a Latino, right, is that in our company, and I think throughout industry, we're always working to do the right things, the right ways, and for the right reasons. And at times, we might have differences of opinion. But ultimately, what we're aiming is pretty much similar things that what most people do. We want to have reliable energy, but at the same time, we want to reduce the carbon footprint that we all have. And that is the essence of why we view CO2 pipelines as necessary moving forward. I know that there are differences of opinion, and I welcome a good discussion on it. Right now, I'm here because I want to show you what industry, what we at ExxonMobil have been doing since last year. Right, there is a little clip, and I have a couple of very small videos, right, that illustrate, right, some of the efforts that we're doing to do meaningful engagement. And I don't know if we can play this next clip, but it is from a safety person here in Louisiana, a leader of the community, right, that has seen the work and has gone through some of the materials that we're putting out there. And if we can play it, he will, in 1 minute, let you have a view of his perspective of how he sees this happening. Can we play that video, Amanda?
Sure, we can play that really quick. And then we'll jump into questions.
In the United States about carbon capture, about CO2. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about what this really is. You have to educate, and that's what ExxonMobil is doing, is they're educating the emergency responders. They're going out into the community. They're meeting with LEPCs. They're meeting with care groups. They're meeting with CAP groups. They're meeting with industrial groups. They're meeting with Rotary clubs, Chamber of Commerce, basically trying to make sure people understand that this is not dangerous. It's the future of the industrial pipeline world. And we're going to be ready in Ascension Parish to take care of it.
You know, there are going to be different views, but I think when people see the safety, the commitment, you know, and we take the opportunity to engage effectively, you know, and get the voices of the public heard and counted to make some of those decisions, we can reach that common ground. Thank you.
All right, we are going to jump into questions. This first one is for all of the panelists up here. So I'm just hoping that you all can, from your perspective, describe some key moments related specifically to public input that you feel have helped advance CO2 pipeline safety regulations over the last year or so. And this can either be at the federal level or the state level. So if anyone wants to jump in.
Well, I get to brag about something PHMSA did, and that I think we were probably instrumental in making happen. So I chair a group that looks at how PHMSA is regulating CO2 pipelines. And we were really curious about the landscape there. PHMSA was not a known quantity to some of us, and we set out to figure out what they were doing, who they were, what was going on, and we discovered that CO2 pipelines are seriously underregulated. And especially after the Satartia incident, it became even more evident that the existing CO2 regulations were not up to the kind of vast build-out that may happen or may not happen given the Inflation Reduction Act and the huge tax credits given by that law, the 45Q tax credits. And so realizing that we were going to be faced with this onslaught of CO2 pipelines that were underregulated, we thought we better get on the case. So we wrote a letter and asked for a public meeting. Now, at the same time, there was a lot of organizing going on in the Midwest, and landowners had become quite well educated, and so had the environmentalists. And together, we knew that we would have a remarkable group gathered there at the PHMSA meeting if they agreed to hold it. Well, they did, much to our surprise. And much to our surprise, they said they'd hold it in Des Moines. They held it in Des Moines. So it wasn't in Houston. It wasn't in the usual places, the usual suspects. It was held in Des Moines, Iowa, which was the center of a huge number of potential pipeline miles, but 3 major pipelines proposed. And so PHMSA brought its people, put on a meeting in downtown Des Moines, and we had over 1,000 people show up in either electronically or in person, as I recall. Was it over 1,000? And I think what PHMSA heard was an extraordinarily well-educated public. And the analog I use is to medicine, that regulations have essentially changed now, the regulatory arena, given the internet. So many of us go to the doctor now, and we've done research on our own health. We're the only ones that live in our bodies. We're the only ones that live in our communities. And so when we go to the doctor, we go in having done our homework. Using the internet, we become pretty well educated about whether it's asthma or our cardiovascular problems or whatever else it is, and then have a dialogue with that doctor about the things we're experts on, our bodies, our own health. And similarly, PHMSA came in and we brought our expertise of our place to that conversation. And I think of PHMSA using that ongoing medical analog in that they're responsible for preventive medicine, not fixing the problem after it's happened. But when we look at what could be in play with CO2 pipelines, we know that we really need a big dose of preventive medicine. We need regulations. We may need limits on the size of diameter of those pipelines. We may need a lot more information than we have so far for them to do an adequate rule so that they can be truly preventive in terms of the accidents and the kinds of disasters that could happen with these toxic, asphyxiant, I'm completely sober and I still have trouble saying that word, but these are pipelines that are different than those oil and gas pipelines that we grew up with. These are qualitatively different. And PHMSA has a lot riding on whether they can do their preventive medicine well. And they did a good job coming in with hands-on meeting in Des Moines. Great work.
So I am actually just going to kind of steal Carolyn's answer, because what I wanted to highlight in her answer is something that I think was really crucial that PHMSA did, which was holding it in a community where the build-out is planned. And I think that this is important for community engagement specialists to keep in mind on the federal level and on the state and local level. People cannot engage if they have to travel hundreds of miles or several hours to get to a meeting. And what we're seeing in Louisiana is lots of critical decision-making happening in Baton Rouge, which is not where most of the build-out is planned. A lot of it is planned in small rural places, places like Lafourche Parish, which are pretty far south, places like Lake Charles, Louisiana. And so we need to have meetings where the people are. And so that's why I was so happy to be following the work that PHMSA did in Des Moines this year.
I'll just add one of the key ones for us, I think, was our Deputy Administrator, Tristan Brown, which you'll meet tomorrow. He visited Satarsha directly. And I think he even met the mayor, I believe, and mayor was one of the individuals that I believe passed out. Also visited the hospitals and talking with first responders. But and if anyone doesn't know, we're one of the agencies, we don't have an administrator yet, so basically Tristan's our top individual. So he's Deputy Administrator officially by his title. But no, just seeing the, talking to first, if you're a first responder out there, thank you. There's a lot of arguments on whether Satarsha should have been a serious incident, a significant, but I think we all agree it could have been a lot worse if it wasn't for the emergency responders and what they did. We call them Jack and Jerry, the Jack and Jerry show they were, but just hearing their stories and what they did, complete lack of breakdown in communication of just basic stuff that should be happening in our regulations, public awareness, communications with first responders. Yeah, there were some arguments, did they contact them or not, the operator, but either way, somehow the system broke down, and we take some of the blame for that. Was there something in our regulations that could have been improved? But I think just seeing the issues with emergency planning, communication, things like that, that really triggered it where we said, yeah, we've got to do something about this. And yeah, right now we're only talking 5,300 miles out of 3.2 million miles. So some people question, why are we spending this much time and energy into this? But again, some of this could have been a lot worse. We might talk about it a little bit, but what is the potential build out looking like? Things like that. But I think that was one of the big triggers. I think the other one is, just continuing to hear public input. We heard about the public meeting, but we get regular questions from stakeholders, landowners calling, emailing us through media inquiries and things like that. So just hearing about that also helps us out as well. So I think Alan already talked about, we did have initial December meeting, and then we had the one in Iowa, which was really helpful. And one to be clarified, that was in Iowa, but we also had interest from all around the country. We had folks from Illinois, other areas, North Dakota, and certainly other areas like Louisiana as well, as least was there virtually. So some people thought we were only doing in Iowa. Yes, that's where at least most of these, or some of the proposed pipelines were going through, but we're trying to do outreach certainly nationwide. So.
Thanks, Max. There's no doubt that the incident in Satartia nearly 4 years ago was a wake-up call for all of us, right? Operators, first responders, communities, on how we can improve awareness, engagement, and preparedness for CO2 pipelines. If you were to ask me what was the single point that provided public input, which is the question, I will tell you the community input from Satartia, directly to PHMSA in the final action report, was perhaps the most influential input that we've had in the last few years on CO2 pipelines. It's become a roadmap on how to enhance awareness, engagement, preparedness. And last year, to the trust credit, we heard firsthand from some of the community members that lived that incident in Satartia that night. And we listened. Industry has been paying attention. And when the opportunity came to travel to Satartia, we did. Last week, I took my company president, and we visited Satartia. And we sat down with Mayor Michelle Douglas and her husband, who is the Satartia town marshal. Both were impacted by the CO2 release from the Delta pipeline rupture. We also met with Jack Whittingham. Great guy. He'll share with you his views openly. And I think we need more of that engagement. We also meet with Woody Pettis, who was the assistant director and was the incident commander on that night. There are a lot of lessons learned that we can capture from it, and we need to have that dialogue to see how we can improve, right? When you listen to their experience that evening and the lessons learned on how to address the gaps identified in the report, we're starting to make progress, right? Industry took it at heart. And with Denbury, who knows a lot about CO2 pipelines, we started developing a guide on how to plan, prepare, and respond to CO2 pipelines. It was issued just in August. I brought 3 copies. It's online, right? It gives you step-by-step in how to plan, prepare, and respond to CO2 pipeline incident. It's going to be part of the pipeline emergency book that has been available to anybody, and we share it openly with first responders around the country. These are more than 300 pages of tactical guidance in how to respond to any kind of pipeline incident. All of it available online. It's been available online for more than 5 years. You can go to pipelineemergencies.com, right? And first responders, we encourage them to take either the 4-hour module, the 8-hour module, or the 20-hour module, and we can actually see who's taking the course. The module will be incorporated, the CO2 module will be incorporated into the training, right? So that we can check the routes of CO2 pipelines and see whether first responders are taking that training. Those that are near the asset, of course, have more of an urgency to do that. But I'll be the first one to tell you, training first responders on what happens on a pipeline incident, it's a responsibility that everyone in industry, the women and men of this industry, take seriously, right? And I'm not satisfied that it is on paper or that it is online. More than 5 years ago, we started hosting in-person training with volunteer firefighters at Texas A&M Engineering School facilities, in Bryan Station. Right? And these are volunteer firefighters. Keep in mind, these guys have a real job during the week, so they can only give us the weekend. But we pay for them to come, right? The tuition, the room, the hotel, and all their meals are paid for. And for 2 days, they get to experience what a real scenario of dealing with pipeline emergency is with trainers, from the arguably one of the best fire schools around the world. Now, I have a little video because this year, right, we introduced the CO2 module into that training. We fill out a pipe with CO2 and we simulate a release so that people can start practicing and doing tactical response plans of what to do in the event of an incident. And this video clip, right, gives you testimonials for the folks that started taking it. So we can play it.
Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to show that video because we're running a little short on time.
But Amanda, this is important if we want to show the perspective of first responders. It's less than 2 minutes.
I know, but we need to move on to the many questions that I have prepared, and then many questions, I'm sure, from the audience.
Well, if we have time at the end, could we show it?
Sure, at the end, or if anybody wants to come up to you afterwards and get the link.
I do want to respond with one thing, and that is a quote by William McDonough, the architect, who said, "Regulation is design failure." If you design something so badly that it's that kind of risk, that is design failure. And what I would suggest to you is that the entire management of CO2 that requires pipelines that are this dangerous is absolute failure, design failure, and that there are no regulations in the end that can guarantee the safety of something that is this potentially lethal. And that we are educating first responders at that kind of level when they do not have the equipment, when we know what's going on in rural America in terms of access to resources, distance to the pipeline sites, possible rupture. This is design failure. That we have to have this kind of regulation and this kind of panel.
I think that plays well into my next question. I was hoping that Jade and Carolyn, because you are coming here, you're representing the public interest in the communities that you come from, I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about the communities that are that have been really playing a significant role in this public input into the regulation aspect of CO2 pipelines.
Thank you for that question. I just want to highlight a couple things. That a discussion about community engagement is really quite hollow if communities don't have the actual power to say no. Because what we're seeing in my community, in Carolyn's communities, and so many others, is that thousands of informed public thousands of informed, sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied, I'm getting a little heated. Thousands of informed residents are turning up to these public meetings and saying, we don't want this. We have done the research about this infrastructure. We have read the reports. We have consulted scientists. And to talk about community engagement and not acknowledge that a lot of these engagement mechanisms lack teeth. They lack the ability for community members to say, no, we don't want this. I know that I talk a lot about injection versus pipelines, but they are inherently linked, and I hope that folks will recognize that. In Louisiana, this past year, 41,000 comments were submitted to the EPA by Louisiana residents saying that they don't want the state of Louisiana to be regulating carbon waste injection. 41,000. I don't know what the threshold is in order for the federal government to take these pleas seriously, that communities are concerned about this infrastructure, they don't want it in their communities, and they see it as a waste of public money. And so I do want to highlight the frustration that a lot of community members are feeling, especially here in Louisiana. We have dozens of community groups who've been working in close coalition together, multiple meetings a week, and I think we're feeling a sense of frustration, if not desperation, that every time we raise a concern, we're told we just don't know enough, and that industry, along and facilitated by regulators, are condescending to us that we don't know enough, and that no matter what our objections are, there'll never be enough to actually stop it. And so we get glossy handouts and videos that tell us that we just don't understand enough, but we do understand, and we understand the science, and we do not want this infrastructure.
I also want to say that we have communities that have had a voice at least before the Iowa Utilities Board, but it's almost exclusively landowners because they're the ones directly affected by the potential for eminent domain. But I also want to describe the communities who have no voice before the Iowa Utilities Board, and whether it's immigrants who are working in the meat packing plants in Iowa. We know that one of the pipelines was actually moved on a farm away from a confined animal feeding operation, a lot of pigs, closer to where the migrants, the housing for the migrants who are there on work visas. So the pipeline was actually moved away from the pigs, closer to people. Those migrant workers had no voice. The urban folks have no voice. The Iowa Utilities Board held no public comment period where people could raise their concerns, their interests, their knowledge about what's going on. So this is an environmental justice issue. PHMSA did a wonderful thing in bringing its meeting to Des Moines, and yet understanding that rule and participating in it requires quite a bit of knowledge about where to go on the internet, how to actually file those comments, when they need to be done by, what those comments should look like. And I do want to credit PST for, and Amanda especially. Amanda gave us hands-on information and said, here's the button you click, here's the link that you go to, so that people could meaningfully participate. And the last thing I want to say is that the Army Corps of Engineers is another agency that actually regulates pipeline safety in terms of giving those permits for water crossings, crossing the water of the USA. And they have just established a nationwide Permit 58, which is just this kind of blanket permit that they can give by essentially saying that each water crossing is an individual project. So they never consider the whole pipeline. So the Navigator pipeline, which has been canceled, had over 1,800 water crossings. And each one of those 1,800 was considered an individual project. And so they never had to actually consider the pipeline as a whole, never did an environmental impact statement, and then there's no public comment. So the nationwide Permit 58, which has been designated for CO2 pipelines, is essentially a way to exclude public participation from protecting one of the essential commonwealth of the United States, which is our waterways.
Thanks for that, Carolyn. And I think that's a really good a point that we're talking about education, we're talking about participation, and I'm wondering, Max, if you can maybe talk a little bit about, we have an informed public. We saw that in Des Moines. How can an informed public better participate in this regulatory process?
Yeah, I would say just keep commenting as much as possible. We did, even though Iowa went well, we learned a lot of things. Like, for instance, we had the QR codes and things like that. We had a lot of folks there that senior citizens don't have phones, or like, how do I even look at, I don't even have a phone that could read this. I have my mother-in-law too is worried things like apps. So it's like realizing, is there a different way we can make it simpler to help comment on these things? So we will reference there is still a public docket open for the meeting. So if you haven't yet, feel free to comment. We have a good amount of comments there. At some point when our notice goes out, we're going to have a new docket created, because that's kind of the new docket for, hey, please comment on the actual language we're going to propose out there. So definitely please comment. Again, we will reference the meeting docket, but please comment again when the docket comes out, because that's when it's really helpful. And yes, public input is really valuable. We listen to any comment regardless of who it comes from. And we want to see, is our proposed rule going to at least start making the mark or not? And we'd like to see as many comments as possible. If it is positive, at least in the public's light, would it be helpful? Sometimes we get negative comments, and frankly, sometimes we get comments from industry. Unfortunately, we have a lot of lawyers nowadays that we have litigation. Quite frankly, we have rules that even industry going into it says, oh yeah, we support it. Next thing you know, we get sued on it afterwards. So there's litigation issues afterwards. So we have to deal with some of that as well. So again, as much support as we have from others on allowing, the support of rules and things like that, it could be helpful. And we are looking at when our NPRM comes out, are there different ways we can help socialize it, let people know it's out, and hopefully Pipeline Safety Trust will continue to support just helping to inform the public. Again, I don't want to use that educate, because I think we're past the days of when public needs to be educated. The public is very well educated. I think Alan even talked about it, the level of, it used to be Rick Kupowitz was probably the only technical person that people relied on, but now it's this a bunch more people throughout the nation that are getting smarter and learning more and asking the right questions and things like that. So it is a really informed public. So we're trying to look at how can we better engage with the public on just, again, at least we're clear when these rules go out, what they mean, and then how to comment on it. So
Thanks for that.
If I might comment, I think we need to give some credit to the trust here. I mean, these meetings like this are an excellent way to get public's input, right? PSD has historically been at the forefront of raising awareness on pipeline safety, and the discussion of carbon dioxide pipelines is a very good example that it immediately alerted us and raised it, and that's why this input is absolutely essential, right? Last year's conference, there was such a wide variety of topics on carbon dioxide. I think we need to continue to have that dialogue. But we also need to listen to a lot of different voices that are coming here, right? On CO2 pipelines, right? On carbon capture and storage. It's proven technologies that have been explicitly endorsed by the Biden administration, the European Union, the United Nations. Ample amount of evidence. The United Nations Intergovernmental Climate Policy Group concluded that out of the 7 paths that they see to reach the goals, right, you cannot have any of them reach the goal. 6 of them need to have CCS. And CO2 pipelines are going to be a reality, right? We need to get the input to get them right, no doubt about it. And we need to have the dialogue to look and see what are the risks. I tell you, I don't envy. I think earlier today there was that discussion. We don't envy the role that PHMSA has. If you look at PHMSA, right, and I'm a policy wonka. I went to policy school, right? And they are doing research and they have to hear from so many different folks. How many academic institutions are doing research on CO2 pipelines today? I mean, University of Texas, Houston, LSU, MIT. It's more than a dozen institutions in which grants are really looking at pipeline safety. The national labs, DOE doing a lot of research, industry, PRCI, API, LIPA, all the trade industry trying to find which is the best way. I mean, the women and men of the industry work hard, and our priority is always about making sure safety comes first. And that's why I think education and engagement is absolutely necessary, and we need to have that dialogue. But we need to be respectful of one another so that we can hear each other and make those voices count towards policy decisions. I don't envy Mac's role here. They're going to have to come up with a rule. They're getting so many different inputs, and at the end, they will push what they think is the best course of action. I can trust that. Right? I don't know what is in the rule, but I think we know the kind of triggers that made it happen to where we are today. But when it is out, right, and there is a resolution of what we want to do, we need to rally on this. Because all the experts are telling us we need to move forward. And we need to recognize the community and the voices. We don't want to do something that people don't want. But at the same time, what's the solution? Right? And we cannot just complain and criticize and not put a solution in place either. So I think it's incumbent to all of us to keep this dialogue happen, but also focus on the real solutions that can happen.
All right, I think that Max kind of teed it up of, does public input really have value? And, we're hearing from regulators, we're hearing from industry that it does have value, but we're also hearing from these community voices that the concerns, the fear of these projects coming through and threatening communities directly. And so I'm gonna ask Max and Nick, what plans have already been put in place? I think we talked a little bit about the public meeting and the NPRM that's coming out. But wondering, Max, maybe if you can talk a little bit about how you're incorporating public input into that NPRM. I know you can't probably talk too much about it, but if there's anything you can share, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I can just say we're considering it. I can't say what's in the rule. Those are ex parte rules that I'd be in trouble if I told you what's in the rule. Honestly, I don't even know everything that's in the rule because at this point it is further along on folks that are reviewing. But I think it's fair to say there are some public websites you can see on what, so I think it's fair to say emergency preparedness will be looked at. I think it's fair to say we've got a lot of comments on how do we treat different phases, some of those aspects. So I think those things are being considered. But again, I can't say what's actually in the rule. Another piece we have, and I'll talk a little bit about R&D after lunch, but we did have an R&D forum recently, and we do have some current R&D going on, looking at a potential impact radius, or it really should be a potential impact area. So there's work going on at Texas A&M right now. There's some work going on with welding and some other aspects. But at a recent, there was talks about things like equations of state, but looking again, I think Bill brought it up too, or someone else, about yes, we do have decades of experience with 5,300 miles of primarily enhanced oil recovery, but as we go now to direct air capture, sometimes called anthropogenic collection, some of these are starting from ethanol plants, but you start looking if they're going to start collecting from steel and some of the other cement plants, things like that. Potentially there might be some other constituencies. There's an argument, is it cleaner or not cleaner than some of the CO2 we're using for enhanced oil recovery? But there are valid questions raised on are there different other aspects with hydrogen sulfide that might be in there, some of the SOXs and NOXs, and I'm sorry I'm going into some acronyms which we should try to avoid, but again, essentially other constituents within that gas we have to look at, or the product I should say. Those are some areas we're looking at. And definitely there's been a lot of talk on dispersion modeling and how do you properly model it. There is some basic stuff in our code right now that goes into determination of high consequence areas that was kind of missed in the Denbury incident. So those are kind of things that are being looked at both in R&D and elsewhere as well. So again, in the absence, or while we're waiting on the rulemaking to come out and play out, we are looking at other areas for R&D and elsewhere that we can help. And we've done some other things. If folks aren't aware, this whole discussions of safety versus siting, we just recently issued a letter, maybe it's a month ago now, primarily to the CEOs of the companies, but also to the public to make it clear what is under our authority for siting and safety and this whole dynamic. And again, that's going to be a whole panel tomorrow, but it was more clarifying information. We did a similar letter in 2014 to a gas operator. So we just thought maybe that kind of helps a little bit on giving some aspects. There are things we're looking at. If anyone doesn't know, years ago we did some guidance out there. It's called the Planned Informing Piping Alliance, but it's primarily for housing developments that are encroaching on existing pipelines. But I think we're thinking of re-looking at that to get some fresh look at what's called PIPA, but looking at it from a new construction side. If a new pipeline is coming in, what kind of guidance do we have to put out for land use planning, things like that. Again, not directly under our authorities, but maybe it's something we should put out there for general guidance as well. So hopefully that gives some input.
Thanks, Max.
Yep.
And we're running short on time, so I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions, but I just want to wrap up by allowing everyone to give a perspective of what do you think the future is going to hold, and looking at it from the regulation side, what do you want to see on the regulation side related to CO2 pipeline safety? And we'll start with Nick and work our way back.
Thank you, Amanda. Right, energy is key to global development. Right, the future includes an energy transition. Even the projections from the International Energy Agency show that oil and gas will remain a major source of energy for decades to come. But we will need to employ the whole mix of new technologies to lower the carbon footprint of the energy we use. CCS is one of those technologies, right? Community engagement to talk about pipelines is absolutely essential. A few years ago, together with PSD, right, industry with dozens of other members of the public, we started developing practices on how to effectively engage with the public. Right? That is a recommended practice that included a process of industry operators, included a process that included members of the public. It included PST, Pipeline Safety Council, it included PHMSA, it included FERC. And early this year, by unanimous vote, they voted on a ballot to put out 1185, which are best practices on public engagement. 1,200 comments were received subsequent to that ballot. Industry is ready to issue the RP, I think, at the beginning of the year. I don't think there is any other part of industry that has taken it this far in delineating how it is that we want to engage with the public, and included folks like Carl Weimer and others, Bill from the PST, in providing that input. And that is a high standard that we are putting ourselves to. And that's because we understand pipelines are in the public domain. We don't take that lightly. We don't operate behind a fence. Pipelines are in the public domain, on yards, on parks, on land that belongs to the public. And in order for us to earn that trust, we have to do our work every day, proving safety and protecting the environment our top priority. And I believe, I tell you, I've been in this industry 33 years. It's easy to hate a brand. It's hard to hate our people. The women and men of our industry are hard workers. They're trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I tell you, I welcome all the input on what we have on CO2 pipelines. I want to see stringent regulations. If there are areas that need to be improved, let's do it. I think we're starting to on emergency response. I think a lot has been done, right? A lot more can be done, right? And I welcome to see what new aspects, of pipeline we need to adhere to. But when it comes out to, we'll be there. I think we all need to have that confidence that the agency will do the right thing.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think what the future holds, I think we need to continue to collaborate with all our different stakeholders, but certainly government, with other federal agencies. If anyone doesn't know, there are, and the public, but also international governments. So, Canada's here, but we're talking a lot with United Kingdom, Health and Safety Executive, HSC. They're doing a lot of work. France, Norway, Denmark, some of those as well. A lot of them are doing more offshore, though, storage and transportation, but I anticipate we might start looking at that here in the U.S. as well, starting to look at potentially storage offshore. That will probably involve Department of Interior, Bessie and BOEM, some of those, but I wouldn't be surprised we'll be looking at offshore storage, and probably storage in general. So now we're talking mostly carbon capture storage, but sometimes there's a U part of that, that's utilization. So there may be a point, and I talked a little bit in my opening, intermittent storage. There might be a point where we'll start putting this into storage but taking it back out, and that might be where potentially PHMSA might have a piece in that. Similar almost, we went through it a little bit with underground natural gas storage, but I wouldn't be surprised, everything you're hearing about with CO2, hydrogen is another one, when you're storing it and potentially, again, using it for transportation may come back out. We might have a piece in that as well, and certainly we'll be part of that, looking at the safety of storage wells and facilities. And yeah, I talked about infrastructure and offshore. I will say this appears to be a bipartisan issue, so I wouldn't be surprised, regardless of what happens with administration changes, but I wouldn't be surprised it will continue. Yes, sometimes priorities shift a little bit as you have changing of those aspects, but right now it is a bipartisan issue that appears to be of interest. So I do see that continuing. We just have to do it responsibly. We have to do it safely. This whole argument is CO2 safe or not, it's a hazardous material. Everything in our regulations is hazardous to some degree. It does have unique risks, so we want to acknowledge that, but we can figure out how we can address those risks safely as much as we can.
Max, I'm actually grateful to you that you brought up offshore storage, because that allows me to make a shameless plug that today the Center for International Environmental Law released a new report called Deep Trouble on our recent findings on the long-term risks of offshore storage. I'm struggling with that word, offshore storage. relating to carbon capture and sequestration. So it's available today, deep trouble. To return, though, to the future of community engagement, I just want to highlight something that was said earlier that I think encapsulates where we're headed. It was said, we don't want to do anything the communities don't want, but, and that but is really critical to me because it signifies that in a lot of ways right now, community engagement is used to check a box. You talk to stakeholders, you talk to people from impacted communities, and you say, we don't want to do anything that harms you, but we're going to do it anyway. And as a Black woman from Cancer Alley, whose ancestors were enslaved on this land, that really rubs me the wrong way. And so I will continue to advocate, and the Center for International Environmental Law will continue to advocate for what we think comprehensive community engagement looks like, which includes language accessibility, which includes holding lots of meetings in different locales so that people can actually attend the meetings. It involves using accessible language that breaks it down to the high school level or maybe even the middle school level. Lots of people in Louisiana don't have high school degrees. We need to talk to them in a way that they recognize. And so I and my organization and our partners will continue to advocate for what comprehensive community engagement looks like. But right now, what's being put forward is not, in my view, being done in good faith.
So I have 4 quick points. The first is that I think what we've been talking about is consent, the consent of the governed. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People talk about the right of consent that Indigenous people have to decide and to give consent or deny consent for matters that govern their land. Communities should also have the right of consent or to withhold consent, to give it or to withhold it. The role of agencies is to provide the informed part of the free, prior, and informed consent, and then to base their regulations and other decisions on the consent or the withholding of that consent of the governed. The consent is the basis of this nation. If we do not have the consent of the governed, we do not have a true democracy. And what we've been talking today is, will we get the consent of the community, or are we just going to do what Jade said, which is check a box? We talked to them. We told them how they were misinformed. We told them that they didn't really understand. Is that what we're going to do? We've been talking about consent, and that is all about fairness. And I think one of the things that people have felt so strongly in the CO2 debate is whether there's fairness. And I think, PHMSA, one of the things you did when you came and listened to people in the Midwest was you opened up that idea. You made it a little more fair. And that leads me to my third point, which is, well, I'm gonna save my third point for the last punchy one. But I think that the future is going to depend partly on reauthorization of PHMSA. I think some of where you've been hamstrung is where you have jurisdiction and authority and when you don't. And some of our frustration has been where you don't have authority and jurisdiction. And we would like you to have, not have to do a double cost benefit analysis where you're going to get sued. When you're going to get sued when you make when you make a rule that prioritizes safety. So some of what's going to happen is going to be dependent on reauthorization. And my final point is, I think the main question that the future depends on is who you think your client is. And if you think your client is the industry, the oil and gas industry, then you're going to completely undermine the community's well-being, their safety, their knowledge. We are your clients. We are the people that, to whom you should be accountable in terms of the decisions that you make. If you are consider the regulated community to be your client, then you're going to make decisions that prioritize their well-being, which is financial, rather than the health and environmental well-being, the safety of the public. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We're going to dive into questions, but just thank you to all of our panelists. It was a wonderful discussion. So if anyone in the audience has questions, wow, there's a lot of them. All right, over here, and then we'll move over here.
Yeah, thank you very much. And especially want to thank Jade, Center for International Environmental Law, has so many great resources on carbon capture that I've been able to use with educating lawmakers and some other folks in Michigan, where they're looking at carbon capture at gas plants. Especially, I really enjoyed the study showing that in gas plants claiming to capture 90% of the carbon plus coming from the facility, they were actually capturing around 6%. Really well done. So we know that these carbon capture systems don't actually work from studies from CIEL, among others. We also know that communities are opposing the pipelines. We saw one get denied in Illinois recently. What can we do to have more regulatory teeth is, I guess, what my question is for PHMSA. Like, what statutory changes would give PHMSA the teeth to be able to actually say no? Because I heard a lot of conversation about how we can regulate carbon pipelines without asking the real question of why would we ever want to build them to begin with. It keeps us on. And I know Mr. Medina said we're going to have oil and gas as a main energy source for the next several decades. If that's true, we're condemning future generations. We know climate change is here and now. So I hope that's really not the case. But what can we do to get more regulatory teeth, and I'd love to hear perspectives from Carolyn on Jade on what the best way communities, the best things communities can do to actually say no to these projects. Thank you.
I need to be careful here because we do have limitations on what we can lobby on authorities and things like that. But I think the whole comment about cost-benefit analysis is a challenge. We have rulemakings. If anyone doesn't know, folks have to do a cost-benefit, and then we have to do another one on top of that. I think some of the allowances recently do the social cost of carbon. That helped us look a little bit more on the benefit side of things, but still we are limited on the ability for do cost-benefit analysis. This came up in Iowa, things like dispersion modelings. Public asked, why can't you use the best and greatest, most expensive thing that's out there? Well, part of the answer is it comes down to a cost-benefit analysis. Can you apply this across how many thousands of miles we might be talking about? So that's one of the limitations there. We don't have siting authority, and sometimes people think we should, but I will say there are some agencies that have run into issues where they have both siting and safety under the same umbrella. So we see value in others having siting. We see value in it being done at a local level. We have heard frustrations that there's a lack of trust with government. I think we heard that in Iowa. There's just a lack of trust even with state government. There's a lack of trust with federal government. So, and we heard today too, in some states, they don't want the government to even come in at all, the federal government. So they'd rather have locally, but we heard here that there's some folks that are against having their state having primacy. So that's an interesting dialogue as well. So Alan talked a little about it. Things like public regularly raises these issues like our enforcement and our compliance, and the fines we put out are really honestly a drop in the bucket when you look at what the fines are. So if we can continue to work on more effective means of enforcement, the cost of compliance, things like that, I think those are one areas we're looking at as well. So those are just some avenues that I can think of. I don't know if it directly answered your question, but hopefully that helps just a little bit.
Yeah, and just to answer your question about how community members can get involved, we've been seeing in Louisiana actually a lot of wonderful examples from local lawmakers, parish council members, and parish presidents who have been very receptive to receiving communications from their constituents. And so, believe it or not, it's hard for me to believe since I spend all day thinking about carbon capture. Most people don't know what it is. And so, a lot of legislators and policymakers hear about the issue and form a stance, but don't know the nitty-gritty. And so, what we've been doing and encouraging in our community meetings is to reach out to your lawmakers, ask them to sit down with you for a discussion or even just a quick phone call, and just provide them with resources, because when people are given the materials to learn more about carbon capture, about the risks of carbon dioxide pipelines, the answers become clear.
I'm not going to go on too long about that because we could just take over the conference with that. But go to carboncapturefacts.org website. That's the one that I help manage. We provide resources for communities that are trying to understand the issue, trying to understand the science, trying to understand what agencies are involved. So carboncapturefacts.org is a good place to start.
Thanks, Carolyn. I think we have time.
If I may, Amanda, the facts are the facts. By 2050, global population will rise by 2 billion people. That's 25% more than what we have today. That's adding 1 million people every 6 days. Most of that growth will be in the developing countries, but they will require energy, right? So I'm not making up facts here. Those are the projections, right? To support that growing population and rising living standards, the projections are that 15% more energy than what we do today will be necessary. Consider this. If every new passenger car in the world by 2035 were an electric vehicle, oil demand in 2050 would still be 85 million barrels a day. The same thing we had just a few years ago in 2010. That's the reality. So we have to worry not just about consuming less, be more efficient, but we also have to worry about how do we capture those emissions that we produce today. And CCS, by all accounts, all the global experts, the biggest climatologists in the world will tell you, we need to have that venue. And capturing from the high-emitting industries, right? CCS can capture 90% of it from power gen, from industrial sector. I know it's hard for you guys to sometimes hear, well, now the oil companies are going to do this. But who else has the capabilities and the resources and the trained workforce to implement these complex projects that are highly technologically complex, right? Don't discard the contribution that folks can give. Particularly, we're trying to be part of the solution. I think there is a lot of common ground here that we need to continue to explore.
I just want to say that 400 scientists, climate scientists, signed a letter to Biden saying that carbon capture and storage was a false climate solution. 400 climate scientists. That letter is online. You can find it. Sandra Steingraber on our staff helped write it. A number of people in Center for Biological Diversity and others scientists helped with that. The scientists have said carbon capture and storage is a false climate solution, and that is a fact.
All right, I know we're wanting to get off to lunch, but let's maybe one more question.
Rick Kuprowitz of AccuFacts. I haven't seen the hard copy of the technical assistance guide.
It's online, and you can have a copy?
Yeah, I have an online version. It's dated November 2023. But I want to point out what might be, and I'm not here to embarrass anybody, things happen on these documents. I actually have to read and study these things when they come out. On page 2, there's what I think is a typo error that could be fatal, a word I don't use often in a public hearing, so I want to get everybody's attention. It needs to be fixed, I believe. Now, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the critical point for carbon dioxide is not negative values shown on the chart. It's 88 degrees Fahrenheit, 31 degrees centigrade, so that needs to be corrected. Okay, and a lot of the dialogues with all the pipeline applications in the various states here in the Midwest, I mean, it's common knowledge. It's slightly below 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So you might want to, somehow this got through. Yeah, and so if you just get that fixed.
72.
Pardon me?
It says 72.79.
I'm looking at, no, that's atmosphere. I'm talking temperature.
Okay.
The temperature is the controlling factor. Eventually, and PHMSA may have to decide whether they're going to put that in the regulations. That's not my call. But the fact is, if it gets below 88 degrees Fahrenheit, which most liquid pipelines, they go from supercritical to liquid, a whole different animal. So I think you need to fix that. Send out a.
I think, I mean, Richard, we listen to what you say.
Well, I'm just
more than what you think.
I'm not here to embarrass you. I just think I saw that and I'm going, oh, that got through all the proofers.
Is this the same that it was before?
Yeah, it's the same one on your electronic version. Okay. And it's just technically wrong, and I don't want them. Again, people can fix that. An errata will fix that.
Okay.
And I don't need to be over here dealing with this in PUCs, PSC hearings. And so it's an honest input. People make mistakes. It's more important to correct them as quickly as possible. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
All right, let's take one more question
Yes,
before lunch.
It's online. Show them.
Hi
the
there,
video, man.
thank you.
Go ahead.
And I want to thank the person in front of me who also had a question for giving me the grace for this. So thank you, and I apologize. But anyway, this question is for both the gentlemen from PHMSA and Exxon. I just want to point it out, due to the language that's being used, these are not charity cases for the good of mankind. It is a for-profit business. Should the worst come to pass, is there a plan to open the coffers, past and future, of the parties involved to make whole what is broken, up to including the consensual retreat of the moose affected by these pipelines and what have you, which is to say the poorest among us who have the least ability to control the world around them? Basically, are y'all prepared to put your money where your mouth is should something terrible happen? Because we've heard a lot of talk around the issue, but I think we've yet to hear a firm commitment one way or the other. Thank you.
Interesting question, comment. I will say we'll use every authority available to us. We didn't even touch on our safety authority that we have. Some of the different phases were brought up that we don't have the regulatory authority just yet, but we will exert every safety authority means we have available, including enforcement, including corrective action orders that we can still implement, even if liquid and gaseous CO2, if you haven't seen, there's some operators looking at converting some natural gas pipelines to gaseous. We don't have the regulations right now, but we do have certain safety authorities in place. So I will say we can put all of our safety authorities in place. Confident in our inspection workforce. They have a lot of experience that I'm confident that our inspectors would do their best job to make sure it's done safely. So at least that's what I can commit to, that we'll use every authority available to us to look at these.
I think it goes without saying. I mean, my role is public and stakeholder engagement. I work directly for the president of our company because we view this to be that critical, right? If something goes wrong, we'll stand by it. I think we've shown that when we have our own issues, right? And we've had them, right? We deal with them. I spent 9 straight months in Arkansas dealing with an issue, right? And we regretted it day one. We were there day one, and we didn't leave until that was completely resolved. And I recognize nobody's perfect here, right? But those that have the capabilities, we'll abide for what we say. We're investing on CO2 emergency response training with firefighters before we start building a single new pipeline, which we're probably a couple of years to go. And we have trained already more than 600 firefighters in the last few years. We got the dates for the 2024. Anybody wants to come and observe what we do? Talk to me. I mean, we're doing live training. And if you would have taken the time, if we would have had the time to show you the video, you would have seen the response from folks. The last class that we had 2 weeks ago, I got folks from Mississippi, from Louisiana, from Texas, and 2 from South Dakota. Summit called me and said, hey, can I send 2? We made the space. We pay it forward because it is important that we do the right thing. And first responders need to have the tools and the knowledge in how to respond effectively. And when they go through the training, they'll tell you exactly. I mean, that's why I wanted to show the video. If you want to see the video, go to www.exxonmobilpipeline.com, and we have more than 5 videos from some testimonials from firefighters from around the nation telling you exactly what it means for them to go through it, simulate a release, and what do you gain from it? Do you have the tools to actually address the situation. And they'll tell you exactly, yes, they do now. No. Is that enough? No. We need to continue to engage and get public input, right? Where we need to close the gaps, right? And I think we're committed to making that happen. But this is moving forward. We want to be part of the solution to capture emissions, to be able to get CO2 of being vented and instead being stored, right? And I think the technology is there and the people that can do it are there. Thank you, PST, for the opportunity to be here today.
All right, I just want to thank all of our panelists again. I think as panelists, they would encourage you to come up afterwards if you have any additional questions. So thank you. Give them a round of applause.